Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Michael Paliotti, Regional Sales Director at MilliporeSigma. Part of Germany's Merck Group, MilliporeSigma is a global leader in life science tools, providing cutting-edge products, services, and expertise that support breakthroughs in drug development and manufacturing, diagnostics, and scientific research. Michael is a seasoned sales professional and empathetic leader who has led collaborative and high-performing sales teams for over 16 years at MilliporeSigma. As a regional sales director, he has effectively coached team members in digital sales strategies, consultative selling, territory strategy development, and sales data analysis. Leveraging his scientific expertise and business acumen, he has built strong relationships with key opinion leaders, core facilities, and decision makers across pharma, biotech, and academia. Prior to MilliporeSigma, Michael held senior research positions at Cellomics, Genoptics, and the Genomics Institute of the Novartis Research Foundation. Drawing on his decade of experience in lab management, operations, and administration, Michael intimately understands the challenges facing biotech startups and research institutions and offers insights that listeners won't want to miss. Over the next 4 episodes, Michael takes us through his journey from bench scientist to sales leader. We discuss his transition from the lab to the commercial side of life science, the lessons he learned from working with academia, large pharma, and emerging startups, and how he developed a relationship-driven approach to sales and empathetic leadership. Michael also shares insights on building trust with customers, adapting to different market segments, and the long-term impact of investing in people. He reflects on his transition into leadership, the challenges of managing a team, and the importance of mentorship in shaping both individual careers and business success. Along the way, we explore his unexpected journey into the world of winemaking and the parallels between building a business and making great wine. Today, we're diving into Michael's early days. Michael shares how growing up in a science-driven environment influenced his trajectory, from his father's chemistry background at Kodak to his own experiences in academia and research. We explore his time at the University of Notre Dame, his unexpected pivot from optometry school, and the hands-on lab training that set the foundation of his career. Michael also opens up about navigating career uncertainty, the role of mentorship in creating opportunities, and his early foray into the biotech industry. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Michael, so good to see you again. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, no, always a pleasure, John. Always great to see you, chat with you. When I'm up in the Bay, it's always nice to see your face at some of the events that we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully when the Nucleate Summit comes up, we'll be on another beautiful scenic summit retreat. I know I'm always looking forward to that. But, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And, we always love to go all the way back in time to really, unpack and just really learn about kind of what influenced your business philosophy, what kind of influenced your leadership style, and frankly, also what got you into science in the first place. And so if we were to just turn back the hands, and all the way back to growing up, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and kind of what was your adolescence like?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say, it was a typical adolescence, middle class family, whatnot. So, it wasn't anything that was extreme one direction or the other. Academics was always important in my household. And, I kind of really took that to heart. And, it was just important to me as well. It's kind of funny. I look at both my kids now and, my daughters are very similar to me. And, it's like, I know what I want to do, what I want to get her. And like, all right, didn't have to ever worry about her. My son, last night I get a text from the school. Oh, your son was late again. So these things, upbringing, some of it, genetics is some of it, but, and honestly, it was the same thing with my brother and myself. He turned out fine as well, but, he wasn't the most diligent at that time. But, it was important and, trying to, getting to the science part too. My dad was a organic chemist. And so I grew up in Rochester, New York. And if people are not familiar with Rochester, that's where Kodak, if you were familiar with Kodak anymore, was located. And so he had worked there for the long time. He was actually a synthetic chemist. I honestly don't know what he did there. All I know is when we went to pick up Dad at work, there was Burger King across the street that we wait in the parking lot, and I get to get a Whopper. So I'm like, hey, that's the best part. But because he was in chemistry and science, I think I kind of transitioned and just kind of got that, that taste of what I potentially wanted to do, the lab work, all that type of stuff. And I think it goes back, he told me, how he first got into it. he had gotten a chemistry set, which I was actually just looking at Amazon. I wasn't sure if we still had those with all, the types of chemicals. Can you ship that? Well, they do.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. You're like,
and he said he had gotten a chemistry set and basically, blew up his kitchen. And much to my, I can't even imagine how my grandmother must have reacted. So I'm like, that's cool. I mean, I want to put some rooms, right? So I think that was kind of the way, some of the progression of events that kind of got me at least into the science side, the chemistry, biochemistry, and of course, biology. So
very cool. Yeah. Was, I guess, what was it, in the household was like science and kind of, chemistry always like kind of like dinner table conversation, or was it kind of just like, hey, like if you're interested in it, I love to indulge you?
Yeah, no, I think it was, we kind of always talked about it. It just kind of seemed to be a common theme. And, it was one of those things like I was always interested in, what are you doing every day? Or, what is chemistry, or what is, how does it apply to Kodak?
Yep.
And I thought it was always kind of neat too, because at the time, this is really dating ourselves, when they had a real film, there were silver halide films, and like, you're doing silver. That's cool. He'd explain to me, the different, how it would work, and, how it was so expensive to do this and all those other things. And I thought it was really cool too, because Kodak, when they were at their high point, I mean, they were on one of the 30 on the Dow, right? I mean, now they're just, flown into oblivion. And the whole Kodak Park was basically a city within a city. I mean, they had their own buses, it was everything. I mean, it was huge. I mean, they were a big company. And so, going to work a few times with them, it was really an experience. And it's actually a shame the fall from grace that they had. And, it's their own fault. They didn't kind of see the digital revolution coming, but, that's the way these things evolve. So, I got that experience too. And really, honestly, almost everybody that lived where I was in Rochester worked at one of three places. It was either Kodak, Xerox, or Bausch & Lomb, which is crazy that those three companies were headquartered in the small
same area.
Same area, small city comparatively. So, so it was kind of always that. It was kind of a science atmosphere.
Yep.
In the whole geography.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. The where I have family now, or my parents. They kind of live close to Hercules, and that town is primarily Bio-Rad. It's like primarily Bio-Rad. So like whenever I go visit them, it's always just like, everyone is just like kind of like scientists at Bio-Rad. So I can see how that, like, being in that environment could be conducive to the scientific path. But it's funny you're talking about how your children kind of have different styles, or when it comes to like academia and engaging with academia. I feel like I was probably more like your brother. We're just like, I was more like your brother. I was just like, yeah, we'll figure it out. Like, we'll need to figure it out. And I don't think I learned to be more rigorous until way later, and had that kind of like come to Jesus moment where I was just like, oh my God, if I don't start taking this seriously, I'm just going to get left behind. And like Berkeley will tend to do that to you. They're like, we're not going to really help you. Like if you don't want to do it, like that's fine. Like, and so I was like, okay, I need to do something about this, but I digress. So,
that gives me faith too, because, you turned out obviously fine. My brother's okay. I mean, he's actually fine. I think he's I don't talk with him very often. He's like a CFO of a company in Richmond, Virginia, of all places. So it gives me faith that my son may actually, not live at home for the rest of his life.
Yeah. But yeah, look, I definitely had my time where I had to live at home with the parents, and like, so like I was right there. But I feel like, what it was for me was like kind of like finding that, I don't want to say necessarily like passion, but just like the thing that got me excited and engage. And I think something about, and this is just a me thing, because like the way at least we were learning in the curriculum that we were learning was so like text heavy and not very, I'm a visual learner. And so as I was like, before the inspiration to pursue like biology and biochemistry, it was just like, and because biology and biochemistry has a lot of like, kind of, you can think of it like in systems and kind of like kind of,
right.
I can envision it in my head. But whenever I was doing math, I was just like, my brain can't compute. Like, it just doesn't feel right to me.
How come every single problem is different?
Yeah. I was like, God, can't
There's
I
no
just
patterns here.
Yeah, where's the pattern? That's exactly it. I'm just like, God, and I could never commit it to memory. But then something clicked when it came to biology. I was like, oh, like I can actually like remember now, kind of like all of this, like everything that I'm ingesting, like, academically. So it was like, for me, that was an aha moment. And so now it sounds like you were kind of exposed to chemistry via your father and Kodak as you were starting to think about, university. Can you put us back then? Like, what were you feeling then? Did you know exactly where you wanted to go, for your undergraduate, and also what you wanted to focus on?
Yeah, I think yes and no. So I think back when, and like once again, I'm probably dating myself. It seemed like everybody wanted to either be a doctor, a lawyer, policeman, whatever. Now I'm thinking about the Village People. Great, but that song in the rest of my head.
Yeah.
But anyway, so there wasn't as the technology that we have now as far as those particular careers really weren't there. I mean, we still took I think it was called keyboarding. Learning how to type on actual typewriters or very, very old computers, in high school. So, it was, I don't want to say it was more limited, but we didn't, I mean, the internet didn't even exist. So, I mean, I didn't even know to look up anything, right? I mean, it's like, I guess this is what I'll do.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people that went, like life science, like myself, biology, kind of came in saying, okay, I guess I'll be a doctor, right? That seems to be, the thing to do, and good lifestyle and whatnot. So that is how I entered, the university undergrad. Although I did have the foresight, which is kind of interesting that I did, to not take pre-med as my major, but biology as my major. So just in case I didn't become a doctor, which obviously did not happen, I don't go out and try to get a job and they're like, what the hell's pre-med? I'm like, no, it's because I was supposed to do this, but I didn't. So I don't really know how it applies, or biology seemed to make sense. So I'm glad I did that. And of course that's how it worked out. So
when you're at Notre Dame, did you have a wet lab like undergraduate experience?
So surprisingly not. No. So I really didn't make that transition to, not wanting to be a physician until about my junior year. And I remember the time, I knew my wife at the time. We met at Notre Dame, and we've since been married. Gotta get this right. It's been 28 years. So she watches it, doesn't get it right. We've been married 28 years. And it was my junior year, and the MCATs came up, and I'm like, well, crap, I don't want to take that.
Yes.
Decision made.
And
it didn't help that I guess maybe it did help. My roommate at the time, his name was Torrin Fitton, really great guy. He was going to be a doctor, and that was his passion from like day he was born, right? And he is this really world famous cardiologist, works at Johns Hopkins. I'm not sure where he is now, but was at Johns Hopkins for a while, and doing stellar. So I mean, I would see the time that he would put in. I mean, he was one extreme. Not that I obviously wasn't studying hard, but I'm like, God, I just don't have that passion, right?
Yep.
And if I don't have that passion, that can't be the right thing for me. And it kind of was a default anyway. And so I didn't have the lab experience because I just never thought that I was going to be in research. And I'll be honest with you, even before, I went into my master's degree, I wasn't going to do research either. And I don't even think you probably don't even know this, but after I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, I actually went to optometry school. I'm like, okay, this is kind of it's kind of like a doctor, right? And so I was in optometry school for and this was in Chicago, the south side of Chicago. So it was a really rough area. And I was there for probably, maybe only like 3 or 4 months. And part of that was, I think, too, is like, okay, I'm not sure that this is exactly what I wanted to do. Like I said, I was in the south side of Chicago, and the part of the rationale why they had the school there is because it was lower socioeconomic class. You get a lot more pathologies of people come in, it's free and all that stuff. So you really get good training. But I do remember, when I first pulled up, I mean, it was like almost like a fortress, the school. And I'm like, God, this is not how I want to, how do I live? It was like only a couple of blocks from the Robert Taylor's, Cabrini Green, those types of things. People have heard of those, right? And so it was kind of like, I don't know if I want to do this either. And so that was really a transition in my life that I would have, up to that point, would have never thought I would have taken. And I just said, you know what? I don't want to do this. I called my parents and say, hey, listen, I just, I don't want to do, I had actually had a 4.0 at that time. Right. But I'm like, the backstabbing and all this stuff. I'm like, this is just not me. And so I actually had a pickup truck at the time. So I just threw all the stuff back in the pickup truck and headed home and, just plopped at the front door. And my parents were like, okay, well, now what are you going to do? I'm like, I don't know. Well, the first thing I remember that they told me the first thing you needed to do is get a job. It doesn't matter what it is, right? So that you can make some money and save up for whatever your next step was. And so I actually did. I worked. So I was back in Rochester, and I worked for a law firm for a while. Actually, I worked for Xerox Business Services. They did like the mail and the postage, or delivering the mail, but also messenger services and all that stuff for a variety of different law firms and other institutions that needed that type of service. So I was at a law firm, and that was really cool because I met so many different people there, and I got to really know a variety of different things, not only from the law standpoint, but just interacting with people. And you found out that the most, as I found throughout my career, the most influential people were the administrative assistants, right? I found out more from them and whatnot, and really fostered some really cool relationships with some of them. So so I did that for a while, and I remember one point when we had gone on vacation. So my in-laws live in Phoenix, and so we were out here visiting, and I was taking a walk with my father-in-law, and who was an electrical engineer. He worked for BA Systems and he was at the Pentagon and all this other stuff, but we don't even know what he did. And so really highly successful, science-oriented guy too. And I said, I just feel like a failure because here I had all these plans, and I went to the University of Notre Dame. I was valedictorian in my high school, for crying out loud, and all of a sudden here I am, I'm working for a law firm, but not even a law firm. I'm just delivering the mail to them, right? And I don't know what I want to do, right? And I remember him telling me, taking me aside, say, hey, this, you don't have to know what you want to do. You just need to find, like you were saying earlier, your niche and what makes you happy, and go from there. And so that made me feel a lot better because, you get to that point, you're like, I've invested all this time, I've invested all this, well, my parents invested the money, but, all the money, right? And I had this degree, and all of a sudden I'm like, really? And so it took me some time, but that's when I figured, okay, I want to go back to, get my degree. I know I didn't want my PhD, because that was just too much, and I'm glad I didn't do that. And we can chat about that if you want to, but so I said, I want to go back and get my master's degree. So that's where I applied to Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. My brother happened to be an undergrad there too. It was kind of coincidental that I chose that, but I did apply to other places. And so that's how I got to that path. And that's where I really started the research, and really I got more interested in doing that for, potentially for a job.
That's really cool. And there's so many things that stood out to me as you were, kind of describing that post undergrad, kind of like existential, kind of like crisis, what it could feel like one. Because I had the same thing. I didn't want to go be a practicing physician. I definitely, at least I was fortunate enough to enjoy lab work, but I wasn't quite there where I was like, this is the long-term thing.
Yeah.
And I also worked at a law firm. And
oh, really?
yeah. I also, and I think, love my folks who are in the legal realm. It wasn't for me. It's a different kind of work. And at that point, it was exactly kind of like a similar situation where it's just like, went back to mom and dad. I was like, can I just help me figure this out for a moment? I worked super hard, trying to get my biochemistry, learn biochemistry and do all this. I was like, I just need to figure this out momentarily. And I think too, the exactly what you said is just and your in-law, kind of the advice is you don't need to have it all figured out. You really don't. And I think a lot of the time, especially with the proliferation of just the internet, people there's more avenues to consume more information now.
Yes.
And a lot of people are just this is how you need to do this to get to that, or like, and it can be overly prescriptive. And then I think if you like, I can imagine it. I'm just like trying to be empathetic about it. It's like if I were in your shoes and everyone's telling you need to do this to get that, but you're like, that's not resonating with you. You can just like, oh my God, like you can feel like there seems to be
people
these
down
paths.
or I'm failing. Yeah. Cause it was always like, I had this path, right? And so far up to that point, I traversed quite a bit of it successfully. And then all of a sudden it didn't end where I thought it was going to be. And like, now I had no idea where to go.
Yeah. And something too that really stood out to me as well is the, like at your law firm kind of Xerox business services experience, I've noticed this too, like the kind of administrative assistant, executive assistant role. It's a really interesting opportunity because like you're able to get exposure to, like if you're kind of working with an exec who's just kind of all over the place, all across a company, you get exposure to so many different things. You're like,
yeah,
finance, operations, legal, sales, marketing, and you can kind of just like, it's kind of like a cheat code almost.
Yeah.
Versus like if you join a specific role in a specific department, it's really hard to like get that breadth of exposure. Whereas if you are able to like, and that role being kind of like, you're kind of like, I don't want to say like on an island, but you're kind of like this free floating.
Well, and it's kind of interesting that you use that analogy too, because that was actually very similar to why I didn't get my PhD, right? I felt my master's was kind of going to give me more open, where PhD is like, oh, wait, you're going to focus on this and you got to finish a project and might take you a long time. And then heaven forbid, that's not good enough. You got to do a postdoc. I'm like, this is just stupid. Not that I didn't have a thesis for my master's, but it was more defined, right? And I did try a lot of different things. I'm like, all right, I'm not pigeonholed into this particular gene right now. Then I go out into the real world and I'm like, what do you know? This gene.
Yeah. Totally. And that I've always, at least for me, I think that has at least served me well, is kind of getting that breadth of exposure. I'd like to think like I definitely have friends, colleagues, and family members who are excelling with that deep specialization, and they're like top percentile of that kind of domain. But I've never seen myself as like that. I was kind of like, yeah, I'm like pretty decent at a lot of things. Like,
exactly.
I'm pretty decent, and I might not, yeah, I'll follow you. I can follow, but I won't lead on this. But that element of being able to like do that across domains I found that I have found that whether it's biological thinking or is it like, kind of more quantitative like marketing, it all cross pollinates, and you find a way to utilize these skill sets, or like, and so anyways, tell us about your master's experience. It sounds like you kind of had a similar mindset around it. And then it sounds like this is when you started to actually get more wet lab experience.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons I actually like Duquesne, and for everybody out there that doesn't know how to spell, that's the Duquesne that you never knew how to pronounce, and you see them in the NCAA tournament. Who's Duquesne? No, it's Duquesne. Yeah. Part of the reason I chose them is because it was strictly a master's program too. They did not have a PhD. I think they subsequently do now, but so there was no focus as you were a secondary citizen, right? So that's part of the reason I liked it. And therefore their master's program was the research that they did. And so I really enjoyed that. I worked in the lab of Dr. Peter Kastrick, and he was a microbiologist by trade. And obviously, we did a lot of molecular biology and that type of stuff. And the one thing this is more of a sign of the times, but I really did appreciate it is not only for lack of, some of the technology, but also because it was a master's program, there wasn't as much funding either. Everything I learned, I did the old fashioned way, right? So when we did PCR, you still had the oil that you had to put on the top. There were no heated lids and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And, DNA extractions were with phenol chloroform. So maybe it wasn't the safest stuff that we did,
like mouth pipetting.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's like, and so, but when I went out in the real world, and then we started using, spin columns for DNA prep, I'm like, well, that's cool, but I actually know why it works, right? Or I know how it works, or, so it was really, eye-opening to me. And, other people, it's like they've been using kits their whole life or whatever. And let's say that you have to really know, but you just have a deeper understanding of the science. And so I think I had more of appreciation, not only of what the processes were, but like what I knew, I had to do and how much easier it is now, right? And how much more efficient it is. So I really enjoyed that. And, he was a good mentor. He was, strict, but fair. And that's, the kind of overall working environment, I like to be in. You want to be held accountable, but you don't want to be, subjugated to, just, crazy little duties either. So I learned a lot from that. And the nice thing too is it was more broad based. So, I had microbiology classes. I also had molecular biology classes, but so I didn't learn just one thing. It was more of a, I don't know, kind of a liberal arts biology-ish, master's program, and so that then ended up, I think working really well for me trying to find a job thereafter.
Very cool, and I love that. And I think too, like when I got my first wet lab experience as well, it's just that. Exactly what you're describing, like being held accountable. There's like, and like kind of like setting the bar. Yeah. Like that was kind of like one of the come to Jesus moments. It's just like, oh, the bar is like up here. Like I really need to step it up. And it really just like fine tuned like how I carried like that work ethic and how I carried myself, which was like really necessary and very formative for me. And I love that too. It's just like, what you said is also high standard, but also just fair. Like, yeah, that's the perfect combination. Like, and love that they gave you the ability to just like kind of have that breadth of exposure. Because I think too, I was like thinking about it for the reason why I even worked at that law firm was because I basically doubled in philosophy. And so there was a moment where I thought that I was like, maybe I'll like utilize this biochemistry plus like legal kind of like studies to become like a patent lawyer or like, but I was like, oh, the law firm life isn't for me. But I still, even though I kind of hung up the kind of jurisprudence kind of like lens, I still utilize those kind of like, the rigor of like philosophical thinking, kind of like a lot of kind of like thought experiments and kind of like logic, kind of like argument stuff. And it helps in business because like, whenever we're like drafting contracts and stuff like that, I still am like, oh, like this is kind of the stuff that I was learning in school. I'm actually using it. I don't have the JD, but it's still actually useful. So like, mom, dad, like I'm actually getting value from for you helping me with school. So after it sounds like you got a awesome exposure and like, experience at master's, maybe before moving into your first kind of, right after like first roles outside of school. Just how was, being in Pittsburgh? You talked about being in New York, Notre Dame, and then, now at Duquesne. What were that personally for you? Just like being in different places.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience for me because really, I grew up in the suburbs and South Bend, Indiana is nothing to really write home about as far as this city's concerned. Nothing against them, but it's just not that big, right? Yeah. And so then Duquesne University was literally downtown on the bluff in Pittsburgh, so it was a much more urban setting. And so it was the first time where I had my own apartment, right? I used to walk across the bridge and up the bluff, and to school every day, and so it was interesting to me because not only was I pursuing something now that I feel I had a better grasp on, but I was actually like living real life, right? I had to go do quick freeze, and I had to make cook stuff, and my wife will never let me forget. There was times where like I would say I would cook some soup, right? And I figured, well, you talk about efficiency instead of like just pouring it in a saucepan, cooking up. I just opened up the can, just set the can right on the oven or on the stove, and then stir it a little bit, and then get a hot hand, and then pick it up and just eat it out. I mean, it's the pan, it's the bowl, and you don't have to clean up everything.
Yeah.
So I used to do that all the time.
Efficiency.
I mean, I probably shouldn't say that, but I mean, hey, there's efficiency. And there was times where I remember she would come and visit me, and I didn't have a dishwasher and the dishes weren't there. I'm like, she's like, you need to do the dishes. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm just going to throw them out.
Pure efficiency. It's going to take me longer to do this.
I don't need bowls anyway. I mean, as long as they have a can opener and a spoon, I'm good to go.
Yeah, it's so fun. I have a similar story too. Like when my wife and I were, in our early apartments, we would be like making like soup as well, and I would just like grab the actual like pot and just like eat it out of the pot. Like I don't want to clean the bowl. And she's like, exactly. Could you not do that, please? Like, can you be just like civilized for a moment and get a bowl and like do this? But I love that. And so now, this sounds like Duquesne sounds like a pretty like pivotal kind of moment for you. And how did you approach like finding your first gig?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So I had a really good friend at Duquesne, and we did everything together. He was actually in my wedding as well, and he had a contact over at the University of Pittsburgh, and he had gotten a job over there. And so, luckily for me, they wanted 2 research associates at the time, and so he recommended me, and so that's how that worked out, which was really cool. I mean, trying to find your first job sometime it's crazy. And I won't tell you how much, they paid us. It was ridiculous if you think about it right now. And so that worked out really well because there were two postdocs it was in Ronald Montelaro's lab. They did HIV work at the University of Pittsburgh, really well-funded lab, pretty big lab. I would say there's probably about 15 people. And there were 2 postdocs that were looking for, research associates. So he worked for one and I worked for the other. And so I did that for a couple of years. And of course, you gain more experience there, especially being at the University of Pittsburgh versus Duquesne. Obviously, the funding was much more, robust, if you will, at the larger university. And I'm only down the street from each other. So I really got that experience and kind of learned, some more techniques, had a more funding available to me to learn to do more stuff. And so that's where I started to learn more cell culture, ELISAs, other immunoassays. And it's very, very funny that I end up working for Millipore Sigma. I remember one time we had a MilliQ system and I was filling up one of those carboys. And there's a reason why they put the carboys in the sinks when they fill them up, because if you don't and you go to lunch and you come back and there's like this much water out of oh yeah, I forgot about that. So I'll never forget that. I remember walking in, everybody's like, what I'm like, sorry.
My bad. My bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They fixed those now. I know you can do volumetric stuff, but that's kind of funny. That was really really great too. And I think one of the key things there was who I worked for. So I worked for Dr. Sarah Tenza at the time, and she was a really good mentor for me. Very same thing, strict but fair. You're a classic scientist, but it was through her that I actually was able to, follow, if you will, in my next progressions of a step. So, I guess I'm already going on the theme is like, hey, it's who you hitch your cart to is really kind of, helps as well. I mean, obviously you have to know what you're doing, but, knowing my one friend getting to the University of Pittsburgh, and then knowing Sarah, who went to Solomix, which was a small startup in Pittsburgh at the time, she pulled me over, after a short amount of time. Now, I will say this, another thing that's not on my resume that you may be interested in. And so when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I'm like, all right, cool, this is nice. It came up that they were looking, I found out, I don't know how, but for a forensic scientist for the Pennsylvania State Police.
Whoa.
And to get that job, you had to take the civil service exam, right? And I remember taking it, and there's all these really specific questions about whatever they do, right? And I'm like, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know, whatever. I'm like, so I took it. I'm like, whatever, it is what it is. It's kind of a pie in the sky type thing. Well, anyway, they called me in for an interview, and, I pretty much tell them that. I say, hey, I do not know some of this stuff. I said, but, here's my background. Here's what I do. I mean, I can learn it, right? And I think with my personality, they're like, so they gave me a shot. And so I actually worked for the Pennsylvania State Police for 8 months. It was at the barracks outside of Pittsburgh, which is Greensburg, which is about an hour and 15 minutes outside the city. So it was a decent drive for me every day. And that was another eye-opening experience too. You talk about, low funding and whatnot, and everybody's nowadays, especially like, oh, CSI, that must have been so cool. that was the worst job. I mean,
Yeah.
what we did, I mean, it wasn't all this like, fancy stuff going out into into the crime scenes or whatnot. No, it was just being at this bench with basically very, very little, funding to do really anything. And I don't mean to be coarse or anything, but all I did was rape kit after rape kit after rape kit, right? And so it got to be very monotonous, but also got to be a little bit, psychologically disturbing, if you will. When you're like, wow, there's this many cases that are, have, rape's the issue or, whatever. And so I was in the group that was doing obviously bodily fluids, blood serology and that type of thing. So that became very monotonous. But one of the things that was really cool though, is when I first started there, they would send me to Harrisburg, capital of Pennsylvania, where headquarters was for the Pennsylvania State Police, during the week for, I think it was about a month, and I could come back to Pittsburgh on the weekends. And so they gave me this cop car. It was an unmarked cop car so it was a Caprice Classic, but it had a Corvette engine in it. It was really cool. God. They're like, here, you can drive this. Like, sweet. So I made it to Harrisburg in like no time. But I learned a lot there too. It was just coincidental. I happened to be like only one of two people that were training at the time. And the lady there who was, pretty much putting us through all the trainings was just awesome. And I ended up going over to her house for dinner a couple nights, and she was married to a state trooper and all this other stuff. Got to know him really well, but I learned so much of like what all the different stuff they did. And people always ask me what was the most interesting thing, and I always say, and they're surprised that it was documents, basically. Forgeries or, basically pulling off signatures with using different types of chemicals and stuff, or handwriting analysis. And like that, I thought was always the coolest part. But the problem was in Pennsylvania, they had like a division of labor. Civilians only did certain things, and then troopers did others. So civilians did like DNA, blood, drugs, not literally, but drug analysis, arson, and that type of stuff. And then the troopers would do documents, ballistics, and a few other things. So unfortunately, I never really. And the troopers would go out into the field and collect the evidence. So we never went out there either. So all that kind of fun stuff you see on TV, like using luminol to follow the path and all that other stuff. It's like, no, they just give you the piece that has the blood on it, and you just say, yeah, it's AB positive. So
man, that's great. Like, oh man, that looks kind of badass over there. Like forgery and whatnot. That's crazy. Also, they're just like, here are the keys to having like, here are the keys. Enjoy it. That's such a wild fun. What a wild trip. And I think like, what it sounds like is that you're getting, there's a couple elements. You're continuing to get broad exposure and just being almost sounds like a sponge, and just seeing how these tools and techniques that you've applied or you've gotten and acquired can be applied in like tons of different applications. And something that stood out to me too is kind of who you're hitching your wagon to is an important thing, because I think sometimes as scientists, it could be, you're not, when you're doing bench research, that's not really a focal point. It's just like, do the research, and do good research. And then you think that is sufficient. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Correct.
Which is the part that I wish I learned way earlier.
I don't think any of us really do until it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
Later on.
You're like, oh my God, I need to actually start focusing on this, because I thought it would just like kind of like, the research would do, it's kind of like when, product, like when my wife is in tech, it's a very classic San Francisco thing. But they always like talk about how sometimes there's not a misnomer, but just like the myth that like if the product is good, people will find it. Like,
yeah, if you build it, they will come. No.
Yeah. No. And same kind of, I feel like the same kind of lesson here for just like, if you're just like working, like if you do great research, everything will just like, all roads will end at you, which is like just not the case. It's not the case. You kind of have to, make connections, be like, just like be a friendly person, and just like be like you were saying, just like like a friendly with a lab mate and like someone at Duquesne you never know where things go. And it just opens doors.
And, to follow along on that exact point, I mean, that's a great segue is, so when I actually, left the Pennsylvania State Police, it just wasn't for me. I went back to the University of Pittsburgh to the same exact lab. Now, and as you recall, I said at the very beginning, when we were hired, there were 2 postdocs that needed research associates. Well, I worked for the one and my friend worked for the other. When I came back, my friend had left. So that second postdoc also needed a new research associate. Because I knew her, I came back into the lab and just kind of was in the other side. So that was really, once again, because I left the state police, I'm like, what do I do? Now what am I going to do? I wonder if they'll take me back, right?
Yeah.
And so, and they were a little bit reluctant. They're like, well, okay, and honestly, I do remember talking with the PI, and he's like, okay, you're really good. We want you back, but you got to give me, your word or, some confidence that you're going to stay here for a while, because, you can't be going and flip-flopping it. And I completely understand. And, at that time I was like, yeah. But also when opportunity knocks, you're like, well, and so that's when the Solomics thing came up, because the former postdoc that I worked with the first time around had gone there, a small little startup. And she's like, I want you to come over. And I'm like, how do I say no to that? Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to get into industry anyway. And we can chat about why, but and so when she gave me that opportunity, I remember going to talk with the PI. I'm like, oh, it's gonna be horrible. And, and he's, he's professional, but he was quite upset. And I remember going to the wedding of another person in the lab afterwards, and he didn't talk to me anymore.
Oh yeah. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes that happens.
I get it now. Do I regret that? I regret it from a personal standpoint. I didn't mean to put him in a precarious situation, but hey, it was a pivotal moment for me. That's when I got into the industry side, and that's kind of where that part of my career took off. So it's sometimes you have to do what you have to do, but they're tough decisions, and sometimes you might have to even burn bridges with some of the people that you have. I don't highly recommend that, but if it is a pivotal point, that inflection point, then sometimes you just have to make that decision. So that was interesting for sure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast with Michael Paliotti. Be sure to tune in for part 2, where we explore Michael's early career, from his time at the bench to his transition into the commercial side of life science. He shares what drew him to industry, how he navigated his first customer-facing role, and the lessons he learned about sales, problem-solving, and relationship building. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.